Welcome to Within the Frame, where we invite experts to give their insights on the issues that matter. I'm Kim Bo-kyoung, filling in for Kim Mok-yeon for today. The world has been facing Trump's series of tariffs, including the recent 25% tariff on foreign auto parts added on existing ones on imported cars. Amid tough tariff impositions, Washington's fierce trade talks with each country have been ongoing, with Seoul aiming to remove tariffs on the country by July and shield its industries from the latest duties. How does an expert forecast tariff talks to go, and how should South Korea deal with this? For more on this, we invited Troy Stangarone, former senior director at the Korea Economic Institute, into the studio. Welcome, Mr. Stangarone.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. Now, Mr. Stangarone, last Tuesday marked the 100th day of President Trump's second term, and it has been really chaotic, especially regarding the tariff policies. Now, overall, how did you see his first 100 days?
Well, first off, when we look at the first 100 days, it's literally been record-setting. President Trump has issued more executive orders than any modern U.S. president. This goes all the way back to FDR, where we get the whole concept of the first 100 days of a presidency. And so in that sense, he's already been outpacing, but it's been a mixed bag, if we're being frank. This second Trump administration has been more prepared than the first was, but we've still seen executive orders that aren't necessarily as tight as they could be. We've seen different policy confusions on the part of the administration. So it's clear President Trump has a vision to take and reshape the United States to reorient policy, but it's been relatively hectic and chaotic. And some of this is intentional. They have talked about shock and awe and the idea of keeping their opponents off balance, but that comes with a mixed bag at the end of the day.
Right. And like you said, he was outpacing with all those policies, and according to Trump, to make America great again, right? But apparently it seems the economy is dealing with the shock right now, as the U.S. economy contracted in the first 3 months of this year. Now, how did you see the economic impact?
So when we look at a lot of President Trump's policies, specifically on the tariff side, you've seen both business and consumers begin to react. So on the business side, you've seen more imports coming in as companies try to take and get goods in before the tariffs come into effect. There's actually, in this past month, there's been a huge surge in pharmaceutical precursors as pharmaceutical companies try to get what they need in before tariffs hit. You've also seen a situation to where the tariffs are starting to impact trade with China. Ships coming into the port of Los Angeles are down about a third and expected to go further. You're starting to see discussions from Walmart and Target about empty shelves perhaps in a few weeks on certain items. So you're having these negative effects. At the same time, consumers have absorbed the idea that prices are going to rise. So their expectation for inflation has gone up. They're starting to cut back on spending. And so those things are having a negative impact on the economy. And so it's really sort of playing into how both business and consumers view the economy and how they're starting to take and try to prepare for the tariffs once they're actually implemented.
Do you believe this is going to continue even if the tariff negotiations go well?
I think to an extent. One of the sort of unknown questions with this, and there was actually breaking news this morning that the UK may be close to having a deal.
Right.
But the one thing that came out of that is the 10% universal tariff that's part of the reciprocal tariff doesn't seem to be impacted at all. And so this is sort of the question, is 10% now basically the new U.S. normal? And if so, that's going to have a negative drag on the economy.
All right. Well, let's delve a little bit deeper into new tariffs that recently took effect, the tariffs on auto parts. Many experts say this could have a greater impact on automotive industry rather than the earlier tariffs on finished vehicle imports. Why is this the case?
I think this is a complex situation. We have global supply chains. One of the things that we know from the pandemic is that there are certain auto parts that, for example, Hyundai and Kia use in all their vehicles around the world that come from China. And so anything that's coming in from China, right now at least, you're talking about a potential 145% tariff on it. So you have non-US Korea tariffs that are actually going to take and start impacting the supply chain. You have these questions which the administration started working through on their auto parts tariff, to where they've, one, made a decision that they won't take and impose the steel and aluminum tariffs on assembled vehicles in the United States. So that's good relief. for any parts coming in that go into an assembled vehicle, they're creating a 2-year window to where you still have to pay the tariff, but it will then be reimbursed after the vehicle is made. So you have a complex system being put in place. You have these questions about tariffs on parts coming from other parts of the world that are going to be more expensive. And so in some ways, even if the price shock isn't necessarily as high overall as it would be on a final assembly vehicle, it starts making the supply chains much more difficult to manage.
I see. And with multiple rounds of tariffs targeting both the imported cars and also the auto parts, Korean companies, of course, including Hyundai Motor, Kia, and others like auto parts and tire industries are scrambling to respond. If you can give any advice to these companies, what would it be?
Well, one of the challenges right now is there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's hard to make a move when you don't know what tariffs are going to be in place, whether there's going to be a pause, whether they're going to be reduced, and if so, how much. So I think the first thing is it's really difficult for companies to make a decision right now. But when we look at sort of the broader landscape, one, Hyundai is in a slightly better position because the new Meta plant in Georgia opened up. That gives them the capacity to build 300,000 more vehicles. Now, that plant was designed for EVs. We'll have to see how the U.S. market for EVs goes. It'll also make some hybrids. So maybe the auto mix is slightly off there for what they might want for the market, but that should help. You also have positive news in that the tariffs on Mexico have been paused, and all the Kia Fortes are made there, so that sort of helps right now. But in terms of what can you do sort of beyond having this new capacity in place, well, right now you can look at sort of other ways you can adjust your supply chain. Are there suppliers sort of outside of some of the high tariff areas where maybe you can bring some parts in at a lower cost? You can take and look and do what others had done, and right now it would be too late, but if they brought in extra vehicles from Korea, that would potentially avoid the tariff. That's one option. You can take and then look also at, are there other services that you provide that maybe you can take and discontinue? We've seen already some of the complementary service that Hyundai and Kia provided. Only Hyundai. Kia hasn't made an announcement yet. You can potentially take and pull back on, so you can find ways to sort of reduce costs around the margins. But someone like GM Korea, who largely now produces vehicles for the U.S. market and exports them, they're going to be in a much more difficult position. And so they're going to really need the parent company, GM, to lobby the U.S. government either for an exception or a reduction in tariffs, and to really kind of try and work with the Korean government to try and get that in place. So some of this is going to be a mixture of negotiations. Some of this is going to be about readdressing your supply chain. Some of this is going to be about seeing, are there other areas we can cut costs? And some of this may be simply, and some companies have done this, pausing imports until maybe there's a new window where you can bring things in. So it's going to be a lot of different options to try and sort of navigate this over a period of time.
And all of those different options, of course, take some time, right, for companies to adapt and use. All right, well, let's turn our eyes to Washington's trade talks now. Top U.S. officials are going to have a high-level Chinese delegation meeting in Geneva, as far as I know, this weekend. How do you forecast this meeting to go?
So I think the fact that the U.S. and China finally decided to talk is important in itself. We're in a situation to where the United States had put 145% tariffs on China. China responded by going up to about 125%. And there had been some exceptions, starting with the U.S., things like smartphones, computers, different electronics. China responded sort of in kind, subtly, by a few areas that were critical for them, such as aerospace parts, taking and removing the tariffs on those. But what you see ultimately is a standoff. And even if you look at Beijing's announcements on this, one, I think it's very interesting that they said, they're looking for the U.S. to meet them halfway. And that suggests to me that China is open to making some types of concessions, but to get there, the U.S. is going to have to make concessions as well. So what we would hope would come out of this meeting is that there will be an understanding that the two sides will have further talks. Perhaps there will be some announcement of this, but I think that's probably unlikely. But what you want to see is a process in place for the two countries to slowly take and reduce these tariffs to a more manageable level, and at the same time, try to address some of the concerns that both China and the United States have about their process. And so, can we get there? I think we're going to have to see. But this is a positive first step.
All right. Well, that is about U.S. and China talks, and we definitely need to also talk about Seoul and Washington talks as well. And the Korean government is hoping to have some tariffs removed by July, saying July package, right? Using areas like shipbuilding and LNG as leverage. Now, first of all, do you believe these areas could serve as bargaining chips for South Korea when it comes to trade talks?
I think the shipbuilding is the most important bargaining chip.
Shipbuilding?
If we look at the current situation in the United States right now, the U.S. built 5 ships last year. The capacity of the United States to build ships has just completely withered away. And so when you look at contrast in Korea, one of the world's top shipbuilders, there's a real match there in terms of where we can cooperate and build this up. This is seen as a national security risk. Now, former National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio both were supportive of this when they were in Congress. And so I think, you know, given the lack of capacity in the United States, given the importance that it's seen in terms of taking and reshaping the shipping industry, and I would note that there was a Section 232 case filed under the Biden administration looking at shipbuilding, and it's now going to take and put increased port fees in to try and spur more shipbuilding in the United States. That, you know, this is something that the U.S. is serious about. It's something to where Korea can really contribute. And so I think, you know, this should be a good area to take and really build cooperation and try to remove some of these tariffs. LNG is another positive one. Some of the LNG imports that Korea used to import during the Ukraine war were shifted to Europe, so there's clearly capacity to bring more into Korea. At the same time, there is this Alaska pipeline out there. It's sort of unclear what will happen there because it probably requires Japan to agree as well. There's also very high costs, so I think all that has to be weighed. But shipbuilding is a good place to start. I think defense industrial cooperation more broadly is a good place to go. But all of these give Korea, I think, some very positive ways to approach the United States to try and remove, perhaps not all, because it's not clear if the U.S. will remove all the tariffs, but many of the tariffs and reduce them.
Since you talked about how the shipbuilding industry could be an effective bargaining chip for South Korea, I'd like to ask you, what advantages does South Korea shipbuilding industry have in the perspective from the U.S.?
So one, if we look at certain areas like LNG carriers, Korea is the best in the world. So if you look at that in terms of the U.S. trying to expand its LNG exports, there's a clear match there in terms of someone who can take, perhaps invest in U.S. ports, start building LNG capacity there. And there's actually been this concern in the LNG community that the way the Trump administration is approaching shipbuilding in the LNG side, because interestingly, on the other ship port calls, the new port fees only apply to Chinese-made ships. In LNG, it applies to ships from all around the world. And so there's some consternation on the U.S. side for that. But this is something to where I think there's real ability to build capacity in the United States, meet a need that matches what the U.S. is trying to export, and take and address, you know, this broader issue of tariffs. And so that's one advantage. The other is, I think, you know, we've already seen Hanwha invest in the Philly port. There's discussions they might be interested in investing in another port. So there does seem to be, even just on the business side, some mutual interest in doing this as well outside of the tariff. So I think this is kind of why Korea sort of fits as a good partner in this area.
All right, I see. Now, as you already know, South Korea is currently facing an unprecedented leadership vacuum with Finance Minister Choi Sung-mo, who has been building rapport with his counterpart, Scott Bessent, no longer in the office. And a lot of experts say this could be a little bit difficult for South Korea when it comes to trade talks. Should we be worried about this?
I don't know if we should be worried, but I think the clear challenge here is that we were in a situation to where the United States was already dealing with an acting government. And now one of the key individuals in those talks has now been removed. Will this stop the talks? No, the talks will go forward.
Right.
But could this slow the talks? Could it make progress more halting? I think so, because, you know, as you mentioned, there was this relationship being developed.
Right.
Whoever comes in, they will be, you know, obviously versed in the issues, but they don't have that relationship yet. And this is something to where, you know, the United States is negotiating, according to Secretary Bessent, 17 agreements right now. Now, President Trump has started to back off on the timeline, suggesting that these may take till the end of the year rather than the 90 days. But ultimately, this is a heavy load for the United States, and it's something to where if you start changing things on your partner's side, it makes it more difficult to move forward. And so I think this is more about the challenges it takes and makes in sort of speeding the talks along rather than impacting them long term.
Well, you see, a lot of local media reports said there are quite different atmospheres that could be felt from the Korea and U.S. side. Korea government, like I said before, are trying to, they're not in a rush, right? Because they need to go over the presidential election, and that's why they keep talking about the July package. But the local reports are saying the U.S. has different mind because they want to just speed it up. Since you're the expert in all of those areas, how did you see the atmosphere? I mean, could you feel the different atmosphere?
Well, let's just go back to the very first meeting. Secretary Bessent is in the White House just after the meeting, and the first thing he essentially says is that, well, Korea brought its A game, so that's positive, but he basically says, I think we could have a deal next week. Obviously, the Korean side sort of put the brakes on that idea, but there, I think, are a series of negotiating tactics going on in issues here. One is the Trump administration is probably only in these talks because we saw not only the stock market, but the bond market start to deteriorate. And so rather than sticking to their guns, which originally President Trump had said, Peter Navarro had said, that, we're not going to negotiate, these are going to be the permanent tariffs. We've seen them now move into what I think was Secretary Bessent's preferred approach, which is use the tariffs as leverage to address different barriers in markets. But to do that, they also need to demonstrate that this is a successful tactic. So they need deals, they need them quickly, and you need deals that will take and calm the markets so that way they can see this is a policy that's going to work. And so there is, I think, an effort by the US to try and push countries into quick deals, to get these done, to make this look good, and to sort of take and calm the markets. Now, on the flip side, this also works the other way. If you're Korea or another trading partner with the United States, you're going to look at the situation and see, all right, President Trump has already backed off and put a 90-day pause in. He paused the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. There is sort of this, trend in the U.S. policy of sort of backing off things as, markets start to take and look at skew at what's going on. And so what I think you're going to see is an effort to not only manage the politics in South Korea, but also I don't know that any country really wants to be the first country to make a deal because you kind of want to see what the package can look like and how you can potentially improve on it or do better. And so there's a risk if you're the first country, you probably don't get the best deal that can be gotten, but you don't want to be the last country either. So you want to find that sort of sweet spot where you have a good understanding of what the administration is willing to do, but you're not so far down the line that they basically say, too bad, you didn't negotiate quick enough.
All right, I see. And even if trade talks between Seoul and Washington are resolved, there are lingering concerns that the U.S.-China trade war could eventually affect Seoul economy if prolonged. What's your view on this?
I think there is definitely going to be reverberations. And so I was kind of mentioning this earlier when we were talking about the different tariffs around the world. We have a global economy these days, and we saw this during the pandemic, how supply chains cut across countries, and that's still largely the case. And so even if Korea is able to negotiate all the tariffs away, best case scenario, you're still going to face a situation to where if the 25% tariff goes in on Mexico, any goods or parts that are produced by Korean companies that go into the United States from Mexico are going to have a tariff on them. Anything from China that's produced there, be it a part to go into a Hyundai or a Kia or something else, once again, tariff. And so, even when you start looking at, other goods, this is going to be an issue. And so you can only do so much as the Korean government to manage this, but ultimately the companies are going to have to deal with what tariffs are left in place with other countries and then intersect their supply chains.
Right. Cannot agree more because we are all linked together, right?
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Stangarone, amid such widespread political and economic uncertainties we're facing, what advice would you offer to South Korea in navigating Trump's, evolving tariff strategy?
So I think there's a few things. One is be patient. Not so patient as to take and lose the opportunity for a good deal, but patient enough to sort of see how the process is evolving, take and be able to negotiate a good deal. To understand the leverage you have, which is that there are certain unique things, be they shipbuilding, be this Alaska pipeline, which are big asks by the United States government and in theory should provide significant relief. And so, if we take this UK deal, for example, it seems like a very small package. The UK is going to take and reduce tariffs on autos, reduce tariffs on agriculture, and make some adjustments to its digital services tax. In return, all it's receiving is essentially a tariff rate quota for autos and a tariff rate quota for steel. So not even a complete reduction of the steel and the auto tariffs. And so I think if Korea is going to make significant investments in the United States, it should be getting in return significant tariff reduction, at least relative to other countries. And so understanding the value of what you're putting on the table, if Secretary Besant is right and Korea has got its A game, it should be getting an A package. And so you have that part of the process. And the other side to this, I think, is, we talk about shipbuilding, we talk about LNG, but there are other things I think Korea can do and should be open and flexible about in terms of putting a package on the table that could potentially appeal to President Trump. Right now, because of the situation with China, because of the reduction in U.S. foreign aid, it's going to hit U.S. farmers very hard. And there is a lot of food that's already been grown, that's expected to be shipped, that could be, basically lost. Farmers are going to have to be bailed out by the U.S. government to make up for this. If I were a Korean negotiator, I'd be going to the Trump administration and saying, we can buy more agriculture from the United States. We can help you deal with this problem that comes from these tariffs. And at the same time, it's not necessarily that Korea needs to take and bring the food here. Korea could then improve its own foreign aid policy, take and provide that aid to countries that were losing out on food aid, and take and work on its own international outreach and try and improve its own soft power. And so this is something to where I think creative policymaking could help the Trump administration with the domestic political issue, help Korea with the tariff issue, and also help Korea potentially more broadly in terms of soft power in developing countries. And so trying to look for things like this that are flexible, things that where the tariffs are going to have a negative impact on the United States, what could Korea do that might help the United States with those negative impacts? And then approaching the U.S. government and saying, here's what we can do. Let's talk about a better deal.
All right, so be patient and be flexible,
yes.
I would say. All right. Now, I'd like to ask you many more questions, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have. Well, thank you so much for your time and insights today, Mr. Stangarone. We really appreciate it.
Glad to do it, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, this brings an end to today's Within the Frame. Thank you for staying with us. Tune in at the same time for a critical analysis on the most recent issues with Kim Mok-yeon back on the spot. Until then, goodbye.